According to statistics, 85% of you listening to this right now are yoga teachers. And I'd be willing to bet that the large majority of you don't feel like you have other yoga teachers that you could talk to about stuff, which is a shame because it means that a lot of times you feel like you're all alone in stuff when you're not, because there's lots of yoga teachers going through the same or similar types of stuff than you, and having an opportunity to talk to them about these things is incredibly helpful. And I know this because I just got off of my weekly teachers class, and we have this amazing group of people from around the world who are really bringing their real deal stuff to the conversation. Tonight we talked about basically setting boundaries in terms of our money and when we teach for free and when that makes sense and when it doesn't make sense, and the need to model sustainable professions in yoga. And I just know there's a lot of you out there who could probably benefit from these kind of conversations. And I want to encourage you to join us. You can participate live or you can watch it on the replay. It's the J. Brown Yoga Teachers Class. You can find it at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, this can't wait any longer. The time has come. You are listening to J. Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is J. Brown. I would like to welcome you, especially if you're new, if you're returning. Thank you. It's nice to be with you again. Frankly, I've been sitting here trying to get myself to record this so that I could introduce today's podcast with Dr. Loren Fishman, but I've been having a very difficult time because it's the day after the Supreme Court nominee confirmation hearing, whatever to call it. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And it feels inappropriate that I would come on in my usual way and say, hey, what's up, everybody? That doesn't feel like something I could do honestly, given the current state of affairs and mood. And just before coming here, I was like in my kitchen eating Japanese food with my family that we got. It was like a Friday night. Didn't want my wife to have to cook, so I went and got some takeout for us. And my wife and I, we were discussing, as I'm sure many people were over their dinner tables, what happened yesterday. And she had a conversation with her dad, and it's just amazing how generationally, how different people viewed the same exact thing. Well, in any case, my wife and I were discussing it, and we're pretty much in agreement, although we were just discussing the broader kind of ramifications of it and the circus of it and the tragedy of it all, you know? And we were doing it right in front of my daughters, and we weren't really thinking about that too much because we were in the moment and impassioned and engaging each other as we do. And my 8-year-old daughter, Rosalind, she wanted to know what we were talking about. And she's like, what are you guys talking about? What are you guys talking about? And our first initial response was, oh, it's just adult stuff. Don't worry about it. And we didn't want to have to try to explain it, I think. And then almost in the next breath, I stopped myself and I said, no, wait a second. She's old enough. She should understand what's happening. And I tried to explain it. I know she's 8 years old. I don't know how much of it she fully grasps, but just as best and clearly as I could, I tried to explain to her that women have not been treated fairly in our society. And while I was trying to explain patriarchy to my 8-year-old daughter, she had a look in her eye, a very innocent and sad look. I felt like she was saying to me, "How could this be? Why, Dad? Why? Why are women not treated fairly?" And I did not have any answer. And I felt crushed, as I'm sure many of us do. So, I can't just sit and wallow in all of this dysfunction. I, in the face of dysfunction, turn to yoga practices and to yogic inquiry because it's something that I can do. I can bring myself, at least, to a resonance or an awareness or a sense of myself that is an example of somebody who is not contributing to this dysfunction and pain and suffering. And that is the best that I can do, at least in the immediate. Certainly other things that could be done to try to help our social contracts. But I think that it is perfectly okay for us to engage in some yogic inquiry, even as a little bit of a distraction, frankly, from all this. You can't just wallow in stuff that we have no control over, at least, as I said, in the immediate. So I am happy to share with you today this incredibly engaged and interesting talk that I had with Dr. Loren Fishman. I had never met Loren before. We have many mutual friends. He has a new website that he put out, yip.guru. That stands for Yoga Injury Prevention, yip.guru. You can check that out. We talk about it in the podcast. And Loren has done some very interesting work bringing yoga into medicine and making it accessible to a lot of people maybe who wouldn't be finding their way to it. We talk a lot about the studies he's been doing and the protocols he's been working on. I have to say that I did find myself in a bit of disagreement with Loren on a few things. And I found myself in a slightly awkward moment because Loren is a wonderfully kind and sweet person. And I didn't really want it to be a conversation where I was challenging him on things, but I did feel compelled to debate him a little bit here or there. He seemed very open to it and have a good time. It was certainly in the spirit of friendship. But just to mention, if you're new and you haven't been to the podcast before and you're a fan of Loren's and you hear me challenging him, it is something on the podcast that I give myself a little leeway to do, and I did so with Loren. I think ultimately we had a wonderful conversation, and I have some follow-up episodes that will be coming in the next 2 weeks to this one. I will tell you about those on the other side. But today, you're going to listen to this very cool talk with Dr. Loren Fishman. Before we do, let me mention that today's episode is sponsored by yogaanatomy.net. You probably know what that is. If you don't, let me tell you, it's the online education resource of Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews. And if you don't know their work, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the episodes that I have recorded with them. They are friends of mine. They are teachers of mine. I have studied with both of them. In fact, if you take Leslie's principles class online, you will see me because I happen to be in the group that they filmed for the online course. So you'll get to see me ask all of my questions, and you can have your answered as well. They are an invaluable resource. if you or anyone you know needs to study some yoga anatomy, or you just want some deep yoga learning, I highly recommend that you check out yogaanatomy.net. Let me also mention a couple of my upcoming gigs. I am going to be at Balance Me Yoga in York, Pennsylvania, October 7th. I'm going to be at the Yoga Loft in Bethlehem, October 12th through 14th, doing a series of workshops. And I'm going to be in East Hartford, Connecticut at Sacred Rivers, October 20th. You can find out about all those gigs and all of my other stuff as well at jbrownyoga.com. Okay. Like I said, I will touch base with you on the other side and mention a few things about what's coming up in the future. But for now, let's just get to it. Let's go ahead and listen to this talk that I had with Dr. Loren Fishman. Hello?
Hi, Jay.
Yes, hold on.
Great.
Hi, how are you? You have your video on. I'll turn mine on for a second to say hi too. How are you, sir?
Terrific. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. I am going to suggest that we turn the video off because it gives us a cleaner and better audio signal.
Oh, okay. Let me go up there and do it. Okay, let's just hang on a second. Let's see. Yeah, yours is off. Now mine is off too. Okay, can you still hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me
Great.
okay?
I certainly can, yeah.
Good deal. Well, hello, Dr. Loren Fishman. What a pleasure to get to speak with you today.
Same here, Jay. Pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it just so happens that in the last few weeks, I've been kind of making the rounds of some of your colleagues and contemporaries. I spoke with Richard Miller and Gary Krafsow and Larry Payne. And, it's also funny getting ready to speak with you today. I realized that over the years, I have very often, I think, kind of confused your work sub with Dean Ornish. Only because I think you guys are both doctors doing these really pivotal research studies that people I respect and know are citing, and you laid the groundwork for a lot of stuff after that.
Well, I'm flattered that I'm honored that you confused me with Dean Ornish. I'm not sure he'd feel the same way about being confused with me. It's very nice, though.
I mean, but you guys work in different areas. Like he's more of like a heart disease focus, and you're doing like osteoporosis and arthritis and a bunch of other stuff, right?
Yes.
Right. Well, it's just great. Because for me, I've been, talking to lots of different people and kind of getting their stories and getting some history, so we have a sense of how we got to where we are, and then just really looking at what people are doing today and where things are going. And I think that you're an ideal person for me to have that sort of conversation with. So again, thank you for your time today.
It's a pleasure. It really is.
Well, the interesting thing that I thought I would start with is because I was looking at some of your bio stuff and saw some interviews that were done with you in the past. And I heard you say that you had a degree in mathematics and that the next logical step after that was going to India. And I had trouble following that logic.
Okay, well, let me make the connection. I have a degree in what's called the foundations of mathematics. I was at Oxford in England. And I must tell you, I feel... to make an analogy, I feel like I lost my virginity to philosophy. I mean, I really went in for it. I loved it, and I was able to meet with some of the top people in the world who were doing it, some of the most exciting things in philosophy, if you can consider that exciting, which certainly I have, and I do today. But in the course of that, I was looking at the foundations of mathematics, not actually doing it. The higher mathematics is very interesting, and I know something about it, but it's what is mathematics? What are mathematicians doing when they do math? When they multiply numbers, what's going on? They take a square root. What is a number? And the best I could do in looking at the origins, having read Wittgenstein and Frege and really very profound writers on the subject, it seemed to me that the basis of mathematics had to be the same as the basis of grammar, because only beings who talk and use language know mathematics. And grammar has rules, subject and predicate, adjectives and all that stuff. What is a well-formed sentence? Well, in mathematics, it's the same thing. What is a well-formed equation? And there are rules for the use of symbols, just the way grammar is. And I happened at Oxford, there's a wonderful bookstore called Basil Blackwell, also a publisher. I wandered in and I read a book by a man named Patanjali, who happens to have been the first one ever, that we know of anyway, that ever wrote down anything about grammar. Also happened to be the first one who wrote anything down about yoga. He wrote the Yoga Sutras. And also, by coincidence, was a physician. And so I thought about it for a while, and I realized if I were going to figure out where mathematics came from, I was going to have to learn Sanskrit. And the only way to do that was to go to India. So I went to India, and I was there about 3 weeks, and I realized I was never going to learn any Hindic language, any language of India better than the average 3-year-old. And I was never going to be an expert at the level that there were many experts in India itself. So I turned my attention to just meeting people that were liberated people. And I, met some that wanted to fool me, a number who I think were fooling themselves, and a large number who were actually quite liberated, quite elevated in their consciousness. And amongst them was Mr. Iyengar.
Well, wait, before we get to Mr. Iyengar, I still am very intrigued by this idea that in pursuing mathematics and wanting to find like the underlying like universal threads behind it.
The basis. Yeah.
You found your way to Sanskrit like that. So, because Sanskrit is sort of like this primal language.
Yeah, and it was the language. It was the language of Patanjali. It was his language.
So it was specifically this person, Patanjali, that was inspiring you. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
He also wrote the Yoga Sutras, as it turns out.
Right.
He must have been quite a guy,
Right. Well, there's also all kinds of interesting things about, the sutras and then the commentary on the sutras and different translation to the sutras. Mm-hmm. But for you, seeing that text specifically is what sent you to India to learn about Sanskrit or to learn about the culture in general, or was it more specifically a Sanskrit study?
Well, I was an academic at the time. It was a pretty narrow scope. I would say it was to learn Sanskrit, not to taste all the wonderful curries. It was to learn that language. That's what I went for. But as soon as I was there and I recognized the really profound refinement and diversity in Indian culture, you couldn't resist. Who could resist it,
Right. How old were you and what year was it?
This was in the 60s. I think I was 24 or something when I got out and got my degree at Oxford. I just went straight there.
I mean, that's interesting to me because discovering Mr. Iyengar in the 60s is, I think, a different thing than discovering him in the 90s.
Oh, yes.
It was like a different scene. I mean, I've had people on the podcast, and we go pretty far back, sometimes like early 70s, but not many people back to the 60s where, I mean, there wasn't really like the group yoga scene that we have now,
nothing like it. Though he had a little bit of a scene. I mean, he lived in a bungalow on one side of a street, a residential street, sort of like Queens in Pune. And on the other side of the street, he had a similar bungalow that he used for teaching. He has 6 children of his own. His wife had just died within months of when I came. And when I was there was a little yoga group. There was a ballet dancer from South Africa. There was a Jesuit priest from Spain. There was another American. And maybe 7 or 8 people that came variously. He was very generous with his time and very unpedantic with his really rather extreme intelligence and very impressive learning. He's an autodidact. I don't think he ever went beyond high school. I never saw anybody say he did. And yet he knew a great deal, not just about medicine and about anatomy and yoga, but about a lot of things. About French painting, for example.
Wow. So you talk with Mr. Iyengar about French painting?
Well, he talked to me about it, is more like it.
All right, well, when you got there, you went there to study Sanskrit. Did he give you Sanskrit lessons? Or
No. I found out about him because, I mean, it's sort of ironic. A drug addict kind of sprawled out on the sidewalk in Bombay, saw me and said, "Oh, you're the guy who does yoga." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Here's a book for you." And that book turned out to be a great gift. It was Mr. Iyengar's Light on Yoga. And I looked at it, and the minute I saw it, I realized this was head and shoulders and belly button above any yoga I'd ever seen. And I resolved to do every pose in the book twice a day, morning and night. And I did. I mean, every pose I could do, which really limited me sharply.
And I'm sorry to jump in, but what was it about the book that made you think it was above all the others? Like, what was it in the book that appealed to you?
I think there were three elements. There were the pictures, you know, the wonderful pictures of him doing these things they were so elegant in the way he did them. And some of them looked pretty impossible, too. Then there was the way he did it, the fact that he described each pose in detail and said, now you put your elbow here, now don't forget to do this, and be careful because this will happen to you. That was another element. And then the third element was the very elegant way he had organized the book. You know, this was a man who, it was clear, this was a man who had mastery of the subject. It wasn't someone dashing down his thoughts. It wasn't someone trying to market yoga. It was someone who had something to say. I think those three elements together, and when you meet him, there's a fourth element, and maybe a fifth, his very charismatic personality and his great kindness, his deep, gentle kindness. In spite of the fact that he does deal blows and he does all these things and he can get angry, he is a deeply compassionate man.
I mean, I appreciate that, but I have to say I've had a number of other people who studied with him at an earlier time who had different stories to tell about him. Their come away was not kindness, but that was your experience. It wasn't just my experience. I mean, I know it. You know, it's at that level, that depth. I spent a year there. I saw him in, you know, zillions of situations. I went on retreats with him to the mountain spas and stuff. I used to call them hill stations. And I saw him in a plethora of circumstances. Mm-hmm. And his eyes themselves are giveaways. This is a kind man. All right. So you meet him in your early 20s.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And how much time do you spend with him initially there?
A year. I spent a full year. I knocked on his door and he wasn't there, and I rented a room in a hotel, and it took about a week for him to come back or wherever he was. By the time he came back, I knocked again, and we hit it off immediately when we met. And I just kept the room in the hotel for a year.
Uh-huh. And what did he teach you? Asana?
Asana and pranayama.
Yeah.
And then I think, like Japanese drawing, it wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't say also that gives you a look for things beyond yoga and pranayama.
So you felt there was that communication that happens a bit beyond words that takes place in the transmission of things. Yeah,
as Wittgenstein says, "Woran man nicht sprechen kann, daran muss man schweigen." And in English, that's German. It's a beautiful German too. And in English, it's "Whereof we cannot speak, thereof must we be silent."
Very interesting.
Not too bad, huh?
Silence is sometimes the best teacher, for sure, I have found.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's interesting to me. So after your year, you go back to the States. Where do you land?
Oh, I landed in New York.
Okay.
And I'm from Chicago. Okay. And so I quickly went back to Chicago. Or did I? Yes, I went back to Chicago and went to medical school. You know, I graduated medical school in 1979.
So why did you decide to go to medical school if you went and found this enlightened master in India?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to know how yoga worked. I had used it. By the time I was done, I mean, I spent years in India. By the time I was done in India, I had used yoga to heal many people. I mean, my initial conversation with Mr. Iyengar, he asked me, "Why do you want to do yoga?" And I said, "Because I want to heal." And he challenged me almost incredulously. He said, "You want to heal?" And I said, yes. And he said, that's my great thing. Come on in. And I resolved to use it. And then very quickly I became interested. Well, how does it work? I knew it worked. I saw it work. I saw it improve people with back pain, drug addicts, bad LSD trips, shoulder pain, all kinds of things that people would come to me as a non-physician to help them with. And I wanted to know how it worked. So that's really one of the reasons I went to medical school. I also, you see India and you just have a feeling you want to help,
I mean, well, that's an interesting choice, though, because if you wanted to figure out how it worked, why didn't you just go back to India and study more closely there? To go to medical school to figure out means more that you wanted to figure out how it worked in that lens, from that more Western.
Well, there are books. Right? There are books called The Science of Yoga. There's one by Taimni. There's one by Bill Broad. And yet, to me, yoga is not a science. If you want to measure yoga, if you want to analyze it in any objective way, you cannot use yoga itself. You must use, what I've used are the tools of modern medicine, MRIs and EMGs and X-rays and blood tests. You need some sort of hard-nosed thing to connect it to if you really want to know how it works. That's my attitude anyway.
Gotcha. And so that makes sense. So if you want to heal and you want all the tools you can have, it would make sense to go to medical school.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I suppose you could become a PhD in physiology, but then you couldn't do anything. Yeah. Medicine has the advantage of having the scientific tools and giving you the license to do what you think is right.
Right. So you go to medical school, and that takes a few years, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so during your medical school years, are you practicing yoga?
Yeah, I taught a class at Rush Medical School in Chicago. Mostly my fellow medical students, but one doctor, I can recall a number of nurses and a couple of patients who had graduated out of the hospital there and were doing better. And I did it with all of them.
So you just kind of kept that early period, that seed that got planted going.
Oh, yeah. And I did yoga from the day I met Mr. Iyengar. I don't think I've missed a day of yoga. If I did, when I was a resident and, up all night and everything, taking care of patients, then I would do it twice the next day. And it only happened once I can think of. I've been doing yoga. I'm addicted, I'm a goner.
I hear you. I understand completely. And I guess I'm curious about that. So the practice that you were doing, was that like a specific routine he gave you or something you kind of developed on your own from your studies with him? Or how did you come up with what you did for yourself?
Little bit of each. I mean, I'd say I still follow several of the patterns that are in his classes, that were in his classes. One class he starts with standing poses, and then he does forward bends, and then he does twists. Another one he starts with back bends, and then he does a few forward bends, and then he might do pranayama. I mean, he's got some sort of protocols that when I thought it over, they all seemed so logical. Some people, excellent yogis like Kerry Owerko, they do warm-ups before they do yoga. I mean, 20 minutes of warm-ups. Others just go right into the yoga. And Mr. Iyengar's yoga is more or less designed to be its own warm-up. In other words, you start with things like trikonasana, vrikshasana, the tree, the triangle. You start with simple poses that are safe and at the same time wading you into the water. You're getting in there. You're starting. Mm-hmm. So I followed that pretty slavishly, I'd say. And when I teach, it's the same. And when I I've done some DVDs, when I do them, it's the same. I follow his protocol, even though I don't follow his poses all the time. I practically only use poses that come from him, but not entirely. I've learned a little since then.
All right, well then we should talk a little bit about those protocols, because I studied Iyengar method for some while, and I found that in my view, some of those alignments and some of those things that are like signature, they didn't really prove function. Like they weren't always about my functional health so much as accomplishing the shape. And you mentioned trikonasana, and that's kind of a perfect example for me, where for years I I practiced Utthita Trikonasana, and mine looked exactly like Mr. Iyengar's did in the picture. Like I could do that shape. But over time, that hasn't been so great for one of my hips. And I've really had to change how I do that pose so that it's much less about like that full range of motion and much more about like stabilizing and staying well back from that full range. And I talked with somebody on the podcast, a guy named Peter Blackaby, and the way he put it was, if you were going to teach yoga to a horse, you wouldn't teach it side splits. Like a horse doesn't really have any need for side splits.
It has no abduction of its arms, of its fore or back legs. I mean, most creatures don't until you get to the higher apes. There are very few creatures that do.
The question is, how much of that action in that full Utthita Trikonasana does a human being really need to have a healthy functioning hip? And for a lot of people, trying to make it look like that picture actually wasn't helpful. At least it wasn't for me. So I guess sometimes when people talk about, my question, I guess, to put it more cleanly, is when people talk about Mr. Iyengar, they talk about this like perfect alignment. And I have just found that I don't know that that's true. I don't know that there is a perfect alignment. And some of those alignments, there's like hyperextension in the joints a lot of times. So I'm curious, you speak about them as though they're kind of the end all be all. And I'm wondering if there isn't more room for there to be variance.
Well, I've thought a lot about the word alignment. What is alignment? What are they talking about when they say alignment? And sometimes for Mr. Iyengar, it's very clear. He wants you all in one plane. When you do Trikonasana, for example, when you do Parivrita Trikonasana, obviously you can't be in one plane, the twisted triangle, but you can approximate one plane. When you do the mountain pose, Tadasana, you can't be in one, you can't reduce the curves of your spine to 0 or 180 degrees, but you can approximate them having respect still for the natural physiology. And I think you're asking a good question. The question to me becomes first, what is alignment? And the answer can be twofold. It can be what your teacher tells you, and it can be what is a natural position for your limbs and your spine. The word alignment, I think, really comes from the spine. That's where its chief application is. And alignment then means straight. And to the extent that it can physiologically be straightened, that's good alignment most of the time. When it comes to the limbs, it's usually one joint versus another. For example, when you're doing one of the warrior poses, your foot, your knee, and your thigh ought to be in one plane. Again, the idea of oneness, alignment, to be aligned is to be in a row. And I think that's what it means. Now, when it comes to your hips, I thought it was your hips. When you said I'm having trouble, I was going to burst in, it's your hips, huh? It can be arthritis that yoga can help, but yoga cannot completely prevent. How old were you when you started to have problems with this?
I mean, it's been some years. I mean, I practiced very rigorously and recklessly in my early years, all the leg behind the head stuff, and in my 20s, and I just pushed it, made Hanumanasana a goal, and then spent a couple years showing off that I could do it. And you know what I mean? It's a very pleasurable pose. I mean, it's not just for showing off; it is for showing off. And yeah, sure, there's a pleasure to it, but I trained myself to accept pain as like an idea of opening. Mm-hmm. And I know you've talked about that in terms of injuries, about knowing your limits is the reason why people have injuries, and I think that's true. I think I didn't have any sense of limits on what I was doing, but no limits, and nobody was encouraging me to have the limits. Is what I'm getting at. And one of the things about Mr. Iyengar method is he taught like 100% is where you start. Like there was never any like moderate and fine. Like sometimes they use prop, but it was always encouraging you to see if you could do more. And that was one of the things that went south with me a little bit with that method is like, it was always more. And I needed to learn how to have more boundaries.
Let me give you an analogy. Imagine a man walking across a desert and there's a palm tree and there's a pyramid out in front of him. And they're both framed by the horizontal horizon, by the horizon. And as he walks, he will get past the palm tree. If he keeps walking, he will get past the pyramid. But he will never pass the horizon. Why not? Because as he walks forward, he's pushing the horizon in front of him the same distance. And that's what you should do with your limit of pain. Consider the horizon like your limit of pain. At first, he isn't in front of the palm tree or the pyramid. So he can go to places that were impossible before. He can even reach the place where the horizon was before, maybe 10 miles in the distance. But he will never reach the horizon itself. So you keep pushing your limit in front of you, but you're cautious enough so you never even get to it, let alone exceed it. But if you approach it, it will recede. And that's the way I think yoga ought to be taught.
Yeah, but isn't there an implication in there that if you don't push the limit, you won't progress?
Well, you won't progress as quickly. No, that's true. I think that it's more than an implication. It is stated. You have to, they say this in many different religious and meditation groups. If you don't want it more than anything else in the world, you're not going to get it.
Well, it's interesting. I talked about this with Richard Miller because, he's a non-dualist like me. So we are getting into some differences of philosophy. And it is also interesting to me what you said about the limits of pain. And I know I heard you say that in an interview that you were working on like some new objective kind of metric for pain, which I think is very interesting. I've had Neil Pearson and other like pain science people on the podcast before talking about pain scales. Yeah. And kind of the limitations of pain scales.
Oh, it's so silly. It's such a puerile, linear, unimaginative scale. It's so poor. It's poverty-stricken. So yeah, I got a grant from the NIH to use a yoga pose, which virtually eliminates the pain of a rotator cuff syndrome in a minute. Maybe 2 minutes is all it takes. And I've done probably about 1,600 people by now. And so we have a very highfalutin camera, and we film them, their arms and video, arms and legs, and their faces, importantly. And we look at them before they are taught the maneuver, where they're in a lot of pain, and they grimace, and the corners of their mouths and the corners of their eyes change. And then we teach them the maneuver. Some get a sham, too. There are controls and so on. And then we film them again. And their pain is, they're feeling much less pain, and the cameras record it. Then we feed these into artificial intelligence devices down at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and you come up with an objective measure of how much pain somebody is. Now, I should add, there are very good ways of distinguishing who's faking, too. The corners of the mouth and the different parts of the face move quite differently if you're either faking it or giving a polite smile or a polite frown, or a simulated grimace and so on.
Right, but you still take it off of their thing, because one of the things that Neil talked about is he said that most people have 2 pain scales, and that they have like a whole range of what you might call low-level pain that they don't even think of as pain. They just call that like discomfort or something. Yeah. And that a lot of people don't even register pain until it's a 6 or a 7. So if you say, do you have any pain? They say, no, I don't have any pain, even though they actually do have like a 2 or 3 pain.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I
always say 5 is where it intrudes in your consciousness, meaning the same thing, that at a lower level it just isn't really considered pain. Mm-hmm.
But it is pain, and what you would do for like low-level pain would be different than what you would do for like higher-level pain, right?
Maybe not. Maybe just more of the same. For example, if you had something caustic on your arm, whether it gave you 2 out of 10 pain or 9 out of 10 pain, what do you do for it? Take it off. So you can do the same thing for pain at different levels.
I guess I just think it's an interesting idea that we could find an objective metric, because I don't know a lot of people who can distinguish between a 3 pain and an 8 pain, really. Like a lot of the work of yoga is like developing the sensitivity to be able to maybe know.
It's not what we're finding. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but it's not what we're finding. We're finding people are quite sensitive, and I rate them too. And my rating and their rating, I was just not blown away by it at first. We rate virtually the same. In other words, when they tell me about their pain and they do this maneuver, I write down a number. And then I ask them, what pain are you in? What kind of pain are you in? And I explain the scale to them. They come up with that same number. I mean, not 5 out of 10, 8 out of 10 times. It's shocking. I mean, I've got many years' experience judging this, But even so, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I'm sure there's like lots of universal things for people who've got a certain situation that are helpful. But you also, how do we account for the idea that like what's right for one person is not necessarily, like just because it worked for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody.
Well, what do you mean it? The
maneuver, like just because the pose.
Maneuver works about 9 out of 10 times. It really does. It doesn't always work, but it's shocking how well it works. And so how simple it is. I had trouble getting it published. People thought it was ridiculous. You know, it was rejected out of hand. It was just because one editor had a patient after he rejected my paper who had rotator cuff, and he said, I'm going to try this on the patient. He tried it, and it worked, even though he had the barest description of it, it worked. Then they called me back. They said, we'll bring your paper in again. We'll consider it again. It's the only way I got it published. I got it rejected by 5 or 6 different journals before that happened. It's quite amazing, and it does work on almost everyone. I thought you were talking about the differences in the way they register pain, and there isn't much. It's amazing. There are some aberrant cases for sure, but most of the time we're just about the same on it. And just as there's an objective measure of how well you see, do you have 20/20 vision or 20/40 vision? What's your vision? Even though you're the one that sees it, nobody else sees exactly what you see. There should be an objective measure of pain. You just need to get the right parameters. And it will revolutionize who gets what drugs. I mean, I think the opioid epidemic, it will be one solution to the opioid epidemic. People will know how much pain you're in, and they'll give you an appropriate medication. And what you said is exactly what will happen. Different medicines for different levels of pain.
Well, I'm intrigued. I guess just maybe I'm projecting just in my own experience of trying to know my own pain. Like my mood affects whether or not I feel like I'm in pain or not. Like I can have the same level of pain on 2 different days, and depending on my mood, I register it differently.
Well, of course, it is different. And by the same token, it will be different on the scale. We're measuring what's actually there, not what was there yesterday or tomorrow.
Well, I'm also been really questioning some of the things that I learned about how you affect somebody's system or somebody's body. Like you were even talking about someone with a shoulder situation, and you've got this maneuver to help them, I assume, like increase range of motion and have less pain. Is that like the idea of what we'd be going for? Or what would be the purpose of the maneuver?
It's simpler. The maneuver is to substitute a healthy muscle for the muscle that's painfully torn. You teach them once, and then, like by operant conditioning, once they know a painless way to do it, why would they do the painful way again? It's not a conscious decision. It occurs, at a non-conscious level.
Oh, so it's more about sort of retraining yourself how to move in a more efficient way without pain.
Yes.
Oh, that's very interesting. So it's not about a position and an alignment necessarily. It's about learning how to move your arm from a different place.
Well, and you don't even have to learn it. You just do it. Once you do the maneuver, you naturally just do it, because your body, body is pretty wise, and it knows, why should I do something that's painful and where I can't lift my arm when I can do something that's painless and I can lift my arm? It's like operant. It's like if you have a stone in your shoe and you wiggle and twist your foot around until you find a place where the stone doesn't hurt. Then you don't think about it anymore. You just walk that way until you get somewhere where you can take off your shoe. This is like that. It lasts. I've studied people for up to 20 years after this now, and it holds. They never go back.
Wow, it's very interesting. I'm probing you because it's something I've been thinking a lot about and talking to people about in terms of like why someone's body is not moving a certain way or might move in another way. And I remember like watching even like videos of people getting like chiropractic adjustments under anesthesia, where when they're awake they can't move their arm, but then when you put them under anesthesia they can move their arm. And it was sort of like, oh well, it's not just about the length of someone's muscle or targeting a particular muscle group. And Peter Blackaby talked about like neural patterning more. And
yes, that's a real thing in physical therapy. Well, this is a free study. NIH is paying for it. Anybody who wants to come and have this maneuver done, who has a rotator cuff syndrome, we'll do it for free. You'll take them in, take care of them, and send them out most of the time much more whole than when they came in. 20 minutes later. And it doesn't hurt.
That is what you've been doing. You've been I guess it sounds like boiling down some techniques to some specific things and then just measuring their effects on people. Is that right?
Well, in a way, I started out with this one, with headstand. And I was the first patient. I had a terrible rotator cuff, and I couldn't lift my arm above horizontal to save.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.